The victory that never ended. The cannons fell silent, but the terror did not. When the walls collapsed, something far darker began. For the women, conquest was not an ending, it was a sentence. The city did not scream when it fell. It exhaled. Smoke drifted through broken gates, the smell of iron and ash hanging heavy in the air. The men were already gone, some cut down where they stood, others dragged away in chains, but the women remained, frozen in doorways, clutching children, waiting for mercy that history had already denied them. In the logic of empire, the battle was over. In reality, this was the moment when their lives truly ended. Ottoman officers moved through the streets with unsettling calm. This was not looting driven by rage. It was procedure. Orders were read aloud. Lists were unfolded. Women were gathered into open squares under armed guard, separated from the elderly and the very young with clinical efficiency. There was no need to shout. The system was old, refined, and terrifyingly smooth. Fear spread faster than fire, because everyone understood what came next, even if they had never seen it before. Under the laws of the Ottoman Empire, captured women were no longer individuals. They became sabib spoils of war, defined not by who they were, but by what could be extracted from them. Officials trained for this task began their inspections immediately. Teeth were checked, limbs were squeezed, eyes were lifted toward the sun to judge health and age. Fertility was calculated with cold confidence, as if the future could be measured by touch alone. Noble women who once commanded respect found themselves exposed in public, surrounded by strangers who debated their worth aloud. Beauty raised a woman's value, but it also sealed her fate. Youth meant survival for now, but survival came with a price that would be paid slowly. Older women were marked differently, sent toward labor camps or provincial estates, where they would disappear from record and memory alike. The marshes began before dawn. Columns of women, bound together with rope or iron collars, were forced onto the roads leading away from their homes. Weeks passed in dust and hunger. Those who fell were not helped. They were stepped over. Children cried until their voices failed, learning early that silence was safer than grief. By the time the caravans reached the great cities, survival itself had already become a privilege. The markets were waiting. These were not hidden dens of criminals. They were official institutions, taxed, regulated, documented. In stone courtyards lit by torches, women were displayed beneath the eyes of buyers who examined them as one might inspect livestock. Skills were demanded. Hands were forced to demonstrate sewing or weaving. Failure brought punishment. Obedience was rewarded with higher bids. Scribes stood nearby, writing everything down. Names, origins, prices. Ink transformed suffering into bureaucracy. But the worst fate was reserved for those deemed exceptional. They were separated quietly, redirected toward the imperial center, Constantinople, the palace, the harem. Later centuries would mythologize these places as realms of luxury and intrigue. Silk curtains, perfumed halls, power hidden behind veils. The truth was colder. The harem was not a reward, it was a final erasure. Women entering its gates lost their names, their language, their faith. Resistance was broken not by chaos, but by routine, isolation, hunger, humiliation, and the constant reminder that survival depended on submission. Some adapted, many did not. Madness spread in whispers. Desperation ended in silence. And yet, even this was only the beginning, because the empire was not satisfied with taking women's bodies. It intended to claim their future as well, and what awaited them next would ensure that conquest never truly ended. What happened after the markets was not lawless cruelty, but something far more disturbing, an entire legal machine designed to turn suffering into permanence. Law, not chaos. This was not madness unleashed after victory. It was order, written in ink and enforced by steel. What happened to these women followed rules older than the war itself. What terrified the captives most was not the cruelty, but the discipline behind it. Every step of their suffering followed a structure that left no room for mercy or chance. As the women were gathered from ruined cities and villages, officials arrived with scrolls and seals, men trained not to feel but to record. They spoke calmly, as if conducting census work, dividing human lives into categories that determined everything that would follow. In that moment, the women learned that their fate had already been decided long before the city fell. Under Ottoman legal tradition, these women were no longer seen as civilians or wives. They were legally reclassified. The word used for them stripped away history, family, and identity in a single stroke. Once recorded, the law protected not the woman, but the system that consumed her. Abuse was not excess. It was procedure. Any soldier who broke protocol was punished, not for harming a woman, but for interfering with imperial property. The empire did not tolerate disorder, even in cruelty. Inspections were formal events. Doctors and officials moved down the lines with practiced hands, lifting chins, forcing mouths open, pressing fingers into flesh. Fertility was not a private matter. It was an economic calculation. A young woman who trembled too visibly risked being labeled weak. A woman who resisted risked being marked dangerous. Either judgment lowered her value, and value was the only thing that now defined her existence. Fear became internalized. The women learned quickly that obedience was not safety, but disobedience was worse. Names were taken next. Not forgotten, but replaced. Scribes wrote new labels beside old origins, transforming people into entries that could be bought, sold, transferred, or gifted. This paperwork followed them everywhere. Even death required documentation. In this system, a woman could disappear without a scream, erased by a single line of ink that marked her unfit, expired, or reassigned. Bureaucracy made horror efficient. The march toward the markets was the first test of endurance. Chains were not always visible. Sometimes rope was enough. Hunger was constant. Water was scarce. Guards watched not to protect, but to ensure delivery. A woman who collapsed slowed the group, and delays cost money. When bodies were left behind, no one stopped. The law had already accounted for loss. Survival, the women realized, was not expected of all of them. Arrival did not bring relief. It brought exposure. In the market courtyards, women were arranged beneath open arches, surrounded by stone walls that echoed every whisper and every sob. Buyers walked freely among them, touching arms, examining hair, testing posture. Some women were ordered to demonstrate skills they had learned as wives and daughters, now performed under threat. A mistake earned a strike. Silence earned suspicion. Compliance earned nothing but continued existence. The most valuable women were quietly separated again. No explanation was given. They were told only that they had been chosen, a word that offered hope to some and dread to others. Rumors spread through glances and breathless whispers. Chosen for what? Service? Protection? Or something far worse? None of them truly knew, and the uncertainty became its own form of torture. By the time the gates closed behind those selected, the truth began to surface. The markets were not the end of the system. They were only the doorway. Beyond them waited institutions designed not just to control bodies, but to dismantle identity itself. Those taken away from the markets were told they were entering privilege and protection, but behind palace walls stood a place where survival demanded the complete destruction of the self. The markets of silence behind stone walls, voices were no longer needed. Here, fear was traded openly, and dignity had a price. What survived the march was tested in public. The markets were already awake when the captives arrived. Torches burned even in daylight, not for light, but for theater. Stone courtyards echoed with footsteps and low murmurs, the sound of commerce beginning its work. Women were lying in rows beneath arches where generations before had traded grain and livestock. Now the same spaces waited for human bodies. The guards loosened chains only enough to arrange them properly. Order mattered. Presentation mattered. Silence was enforced. Buyers came in measured waves. Some wore fine robes, others the plain clothes of provincial officials, but all shared the same gaze. It was not hurried. It lingered. Hands lifted chins, fingers pressed arms and hips, eyes traced scars and stretch marks like flaws in damaged goods. No one asked permission. Permission no longer existed. A woman who flinched was corrected immediately. A woman who resisted was dragged forward and made an example of. The lesson spread faster than pain. Scribes stood close, writing constantly. Each movement was observed, each reaction noted. A woman's worth could rise or fall in seconds. Beauty was not enough. Strength was measured. Teeth were checked again. Breath was smelled. A cough could ruin a price. A tear could be interpreted as weakness or disobedience. The women learned to control their faces, to hide fear behind stillness, because stillness was safer than honesty. Demonstrations followed. Skills that once defined a woman's role as a wife or daughter were demanded as proof of usefulness. Sewing, weaving, cooking gestures mimed in the open air. Failure brought punishment, not because the task mattered, but because humiliation did. The crowd watched. The market thrived on the knowledge that nothing here was private. Shame was part of the sale. Children were separated with brutal efficiency. Boys were pulled away first, old enough to be shaped into something else. Girls were left just long enough to understand what awaited them. Mothers reached out instinctively, only to be struck back into place. Screams were discouraged. Noise disrupted business. The market valued calm. Some women were sold quickly. Others waited for hours as their value was debated aloud. Prices were shouted, negotiated, lowered. A woman could hear her fate discussed as if she were absent. Origins mattered only as exotic detail. A foreign accent raised interest. A noble background raised expectations and punishment when those expectations were not met. The most unsettling moment came when selection ended. Certain women were quietly removed from the lines and led through side gates. No bidding, no inspection in public. Their absence created rumors among those left behind. Were they spared? Chosen for protection? Or marked for something worse? No answers came, only the sound of doors closing. As the day wore on, exhaustion set in. Hunger sharpened fear. The women began to understand that the market was not meant to end quickly. It was designed to break resistance through exposure and waiting. Survival depended not on strength, but on endurance and submission. Even those sold did not escape the gaze. Ownership began the moment the ink dried. By nightfall, the courtyard was stained with more than dust. Those unsold were dragged away, their future uncertain but never hopeful. They had learned the truth the empire never spoke aloud. The market was not the worst part. It was the filter. Beyond it lay places where silence was permanent, walls were higher, and escape was no longer imagined. Those taken through the side gates believed they were leaving humiliation behind. But what waited beyond the market would erase not just their freedom, but their very selves. The golden prison beyond the market stood walls no one could see past. Gold hid the bars. Silk softened the screams. Those who entered believed they were spared. They were wrong. The gates closed behind them without ceremony. Stone swallowed sound, and the air changed, heavy with incense and fear. The women were led through corridors polished to perfection, where marble floors reflected torchlight like water. Everything here suggested order and beauty, but nothing felt alive. This was not a refuge from the markets. It was their refinement. The cruelty here did not shout. It whispered. The first thing taken was language. Orders were given in words. The women did not understand, and confusion was punished until understanding came through pain. Names followed next. Each woman was assigned a new one. chosen not for meaning, but for obedience. The old names, spoken in childhood by mothers and whispered by husbands, were forbidden. To speak them was to invite isolation. Identity, they were told, had been replaced. Days blurred into ritual. Training was relentless. How to walk, how to bow, how to lower the eyes at the correct angle, how to speak only when spoken to, and only in the approved tongue. Mistakes were corrected publicly. Perfection was demanded privately. The women learned quickly that survival depended on anticipating desire before it was expressed. Fear became instinct. The hierarchy was invisible but absolute. Senior women enforced rules more brutally than guards because they understood the cost of failure. Favor meant protection. Neglect meant disappearance. Rivalries formed in silence, sharpened by hunger and jealousy. Compassion became dangerous. To help another woman was to weaken oneself, and weakness was punished without warning. Religion was introduced not as faith, but as submission. Ceremonies stripped belief of comfort and turned it into command. Refusal brought starvation. Acceptance brought nothing but the knowledge that return was now impossible. Conversion severed the last tie to home. Even escape would mean exile from everything once known. The women understood then that the prison was not just physical, it was spiritual. Nights were the worst. Footsteps echoed in corridors long after torches dimmed. Selection happened without explanation. A woman would be taken from her bedding and return changed, or not return at all. Silence followed. Questions were never asked. Asking was dangerous. The uncertainty consumed them more effectively than violence ever could. Some women adapted completely. They learned the rules, climbed the hierarchy, and survived by becoming part of the machine. Others resisted quietly, holding on to fragments of memory like contraband. Many broke. Madness was common, despair constant. Death came in many forms, some chosen, others enforced. All were recorded, reduced to entries in ledgers that never reflected the cost. The greatest cruelty was hope. Promises of advancement, protection, or favor kept the women compliant. Each believed she might be spared further suffering if she endured just a little longer. The system thrived on this belief. It did not need chains when expectation was enough. And yet, even here, the empire demanded more. The prison was not the end of exploitation. It was preparation. Because once obedience was complete and identity erased, the women were expected to serve a final purpose, one that ensured the empire's power would be reborn through them, again and again. Wounds of the empire, the conquest did not end with obedience. It demanded continuity, flesh turned into future. Here, even birth belonged to the state. Once identity was erased and submission perfected, the women were given a new role that could not be refused. Their bodies were no longer measured only for beauty or labor, but for reproduction. Motherhood, once sacred and private, was transformed into obligation. The empire did not merely own the woman, it claimed what she could produce. From this point forward, survival meant participation in a system designed to outlast any single war. Pregnancy brought no protection, it brought scrutiny. The women were monitored closely, fed only enough to sustain what grew inside them. Medical attention existed, but not for compassion. It was investment. A healthy birth meant profit. A failed one meant punishment or replacement. The mother's pain was irrelevant unless it threatened the outcome. Even grief was regulated. Tears were allowed only in silence. The law was absolute. Any child born to an enslaved woman belonged automatically to her master. Not to her bloodline, not to her people, not to her memory. From the moment of birth, the child was property, documented and assigned a future before it could speak. Mothers were ordered to nurse infants they were not allowed to claim. They were warned never to form attachment, yet expected to raise them well. Love was demanded, then forbidden. For sons, the path was predetermined. Some would be trained for service, others sold, and the strongest redirected toward military institutions that would reshape them entirely. Their origins would be erased early, their loyalty engineered. Mothers watched boys taken away while still learning to walk, knowing they would never hear their own language again. The empire turned sons into weapons by severing them from the women who bore them. Daughters faced a different certainty. They were raised as their mothers had been taught obedience, silence, and usefulness. From childhood, their value was assessed, their futures calculated. Many mothers recognized the signs too well. They were raising replacements. Each generation fed the next, the cycle tightening with ruthless efficiency. Resistance took quieter forms now. Some women withheld food from themselves, hoping weakness would make them undesirable. Others whispered forbidden prayers over sleeping children, clinging to fragments of belief like contraband. A few attempted escape, knowing the punishment would be public and final. Control over one's body became the last battlefield, and it was rarely won. The greatest cruelty was knowledge. These women understood exactly what the empire was doing. They saw how conquest became permanent, not through armies, but through birth. Villages across entire regions lost generations of women. Population balances shifted. Cultures thinned. The damage was not immediate, but it was irreversible. This was demographic warfare, quiet, patient, devastating. Records captured everything except suffering. Births were logged. Children were assigned. Transfers were approved. Paper replaced memory. To the system, this was success. To the women, it was annihilation spread across decades. Even death offered little escape, because the cycle continued through those left behind. Yet the empire was not finished. Control over bodies was powerful, but control over belief was stronger. To ensure no return, no rebellion, and no memory, one final weapon was deployed, one that severed the past completely. Because after taking their bodies and their children, the empire moved to erase the last thing it could not tolerate, the women's faith, and with it, any path back home. Erased from history, the empire did not fear rebellion of the body. It feared memory, belief, and return. So it destroyed the past itself. Once the women had been broken, once their bodies had been absorbed into the machinery of empire, and their children claimed as property, one danger remained: memory. As long as a woman remembered who she was, where she came from, and what she believed, conquest was incomplete. The Ottomans understood this with brutal clarity. That is why the final stage of domination was not physical. It was spiritual. Forced conversion was presented as mercy. Women were told this was their chance to belong, to be protected, to survive fully rather than exist on the margins. But the rituals they were dragged into were stripped of faith and loaded with threat. There were no priests from their past, no familiar prayers, no choice. Refusal meant isolation in dark cells, starvation measured carefully, punishment calibrated to break without killing. Acceptance meant something worse. It meant legal and spiritual erasure. The moment a woman converted, she ceased to exist in the eyes of her former world. Even if she escaped, there was no home to return to. Her family would not recognize her. Her church would not take her back. Her children, if any remained, would belong to the empire that had taken everything else. Conversion was not salvation. It was a second death, quieter and more permanent than the first. Public humiliation followed. In some cities, women of high status were paraded deliberately. The wives of commanders, nobles, or local leaders were displayed as living warnings. Their suffering was not hidden. It was performed. The message was unmistakable. If the most protected women of a society could be reduced to this, resistance was meaningless. Entire communities learned obedience by watching their own symbols destroyed. Over time, the effects rippled outward. Villages across the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the Eastern Mediterranean lost their women. Not temporarily, permanently. Population balances shifted, birth rates collapsed, traditions disappeared. Songs, languages, customs, all weakened by absence. This was conquest without occupation, destruction without burning. A slow, generational hollowing out that left scars long after armies moved on. Some women survived long enough to be released, traded, or forgotten by the system. Their return was often worse than captivity. Many could no longer speak their native language. Others could not pray the way they once had. Families saw them as tainted, living reminders of humiliation they wanted to forget. These women returned home as strangers, carrying trauma no one knew how to hear. For centuries, history looked away. Chroniclers wrote about victories, architecture, administration, tolerance. Empires prefer clean narratives. But buried in archives were the ledgers. Names replaced by numbers, ages, prices, skills, transfers, births, deaths, paper proof of a system that turned human suffering into routine. Only recently have historians begun to confront what those documents truly represent. Not isolated cruelty, but an organized machine of domination. This was not chaos. That is what makes it unbearable. Every step was planned, justified, and preserved. Law sanctified exploitation. Ritual disguised control. Faith was weaponized. The empire did not simply conquer land. It re-engineered humanity within it. Women became units of value. Wombs became factories. Children became future assets. Memory became a threat to be erased. And yet, despite everything, the system was never perfect. Some women resisted until the end, clinging to fragments of belief, identity, or love, even when it brought punishment. Their names rarely survived, but their existence did. In the cracks of the archive, in whispered testimonies, in demographic scars that never healed, they remain. This is why these stories matter. Not to assign simple blame, and not to flatten history into slogans, but to confront the cost of empire honestly. To understand that civilization can coexist with cruelty, and that order can be more terrifying than chaos. What happened to these women was not an accident of war. It was a choice, repeated generation after generation. The battlefield ended in silence. But for them, the war never truly stopped.